Close to the town I live in, there was an old and abandoned house out in the country. It was a bit of a drive out of town, so a lot of people in my school talked about it, but they rarely ever went out to it. One Halloween, however, a friend of mine who had his license decided that he wanted to go out and see the house that year. It didn't take very much to convince the rest of our friend group to come along. There were 6 of us all together cramped into the car, and we waited until after dark to go out there to make it scarier since it was Halloween night. All of us got out to the car after we pulled into the yard of the house. The yard was pretty big, and there were tons of overgrown plants. There were no lights from nearby houses or street lights, so the only light was the flashlights that we brought with us. We started walking up to the house slowly from the car. My friend kept shining his light ahead of us up onto the house. I watched as he moved his light on the house, checking out different parts of it. I stopped though when I saw something on the porch of the house. Although I only caught a glimpse of it as his light hit it, it seemed out of place. I checked out what I had seen with my own flashlight, and there on the porch was a pumpkin. It wasn't an old decaying pumpkin that we would have expected to see in an abandoned house either. I told my friends that somebody might be living here inside the house since there was a freshly carved pumpkin. My friends shrugged it off though, saying it was Halloween and some other kids probably put it there as a joke. We decided to continue, and were still walking when I heard a noise off from the side of the house. I shined my light over in the area just in time to catch somebody coming up to the side of the house. There was a man on the side of the house, who I caught creeping around the corner of it. He was already watching us when the light hit him, and he had a huge knife in his hand. Once the man's position had been revealed, he began to come towards us as fast as he could. I say that he went as fast as he could because the man wasn't moving very well. He was doing a half hobble, half run towards us, like he was injured or missing part of his leg. Fortunately, all my friends had seen him by now, and we all turned and began running very quickly back towards the car. I looked back as I was getting myself into the car to see that the guy was still coming after us. As we pulled away from the house, 2 of my friends were laughing, saying that they had set the whole thing up. They said they had gotten a kid from school to head out earlier and wait for us so he could come and scare us. I had been the only person to really get a good view of the man who was chasing us, and I knew for a fact that it was not a high schooler. I insisted upon it, telling my friends that whoever it was not the person that they had sent out there to scare us. Sure enough, the 2 friends who had set up the scare checked their phones to find voicemails and texts from the kid who was supposed to scare us. He had been at the house, but never got the chance to pretend to attack us because the same guy had gone after him, so he left immediately. He had left voicemails and texts saying to abort and to not go to the abandoned house, but they hadn't seen them due to bad cell service. We had no idea who tried to attack us that night or why, and when the police investigated, they found nobody there. Back in the Halloween of 2005, I went trick-or-treating with my best friend Ryan. We met up at my house not too long after school and hung out there for a bit. Then we put on our Halloween costumes, where I was Spider-Man and Ryan was Batman. We then left my house and started trick-or-treating in my neighborhood first. Ryan also lived in my general neighborhood, but was several blocks away. It took probably 20 minutes to walk to his house. Ryan's mom went with us as we trick-or-treated, and we ended up going all the way to his house. Our neighborhood had lots of houses in it, and there were quite a few other kids out trick-or-treating as well. After several hours, we both got tons of candy. It was a great night of trick-or-treating. Then we went inside of Ryan's house and we hung out there for a bit. My mom was going to come and pick me up at 10 and drive me back to our house. Ryan and I just hung out in his bedroom, eating our candy and playing video games. Ryan's parents and older sister were also home as well. I remember that we heard a knock at the front door though, and we both got up to go see. We thought that it was probably more trick-or-treaters, and Ryan wanted to be the one to hand out the candy since we hadn't got a chance to because we had been out. He called to his parents in the other room saying that he would handle it. When we got to the door though, we looked out and we saw what appeared to be an adult man standing there. The guy was looking down, wearing a hooded sweatshirt that completely covered his head and we could barely see his face, but he did not appear to have any kind of a costume on. Right away, it looked suspicious. Plus, it was pretty late at this point. Ryan and I had stayed out trick-or-treating about as late as we were even allowed to. The guy then knocked on the door again, and we were right there on the other side. We didn't say anything, but we went into the other room and found Ryan's parents. We told them that it was just some random guy. By then, the knocking had stopped, and when we walked back to the room, the man was gone. Nobody knew who this guy was or why he was at the door, but it seemed a little strange. Ryan and I went back to his room to continue playing video games and stuff. His room was at the back of the house, and I remember that maybe 15 minutes later, Ryan suddenly told me to look at the window. When I did, I saw what he was already looking at. The same hooded man was standing in the backyard. He was just kind of standing there. The guy was maybe 40 feet from Ryan's window. He did not appear to be looking towards us, and he was still looking down. After watching him for a few moments, we both instantly got up and ran out of the room. Ryan went back towards his parents and told them about it. They looked out into the backyard, and they turned on the light to the patio. When that happened, the man turned and left the backyard, running away. We never got a good look at his face, and it was really weird. After that, we figured that he was gone for good, and probably just a guy trying to mess with people on Halloween. So nobody called the police or anything like that, but it was still really strange. A little while later, my mom arrived at Ryan's house and picked me up. She drove us back to our house, and we got there like a minute later. When we got home, I was in the living room for a while before I had to go to bed. Then when it got late, I went to my bedroom. Like Ryan's, my bedroom was at the back of the house. I remember that I turned my lights out and was getting into bed. That's when I looked out of my bedroom window, and I noticed what appeared to be the same guy back there. I couldn't believe it. He was standing in the backyard, very similar to the way that he had in Ryan's backyard. For a moment, I really couldn't believe my eyes, but he was there. I ran out of my room and found my parents in the living room. I told them about the guy, and we all went to another back window. By the time we got there, though, he was gone. After a while, I went to bed again. It took me a long time to fall asleep. I kept looking out the window, but the man never returned. Eventually, I did fall asleep, and after that, I never saw that guy again. When I was really little, my parents would let me stay up late on the weekends. Halloween this particular year landed on a Saturday, so I was up late by myself in the living room watching TV. Late that night, as I was drifting in and out of sleep watching TV, I heard a noise from the front porch. It was the sound of the old swing creaking back and forth, and it could have been the wind, but I was paranoid as a young kid and I went to check it out. Cautiously, I crept to the window by the porch and I looked outside, and what I saw was horrifying. An older woman, probably in her 50s, was sitting on our swing. She was wearing nothing but a nightgown and her skin was smeared with blood. In her hand, she held a large kitchen knife. I felt like I was dreaming, but it was all too real. I was only 7 at the time, so I sprinted to my parents' room yelling and crying that there was a scary woman outside. My dad woke up first and asked me to calm down and explain what happened. I stuttered in between the breaks in my crying that there was a woman on the porch with a knife. My dad's expression shifted from confusion to frustration. He thought that I was imagining things, and he told me it was probably a bad dream, saying that I could sleep in their room for the rest of the night if I wanted. I wouldn't let it go though, and finally I managed to convince him to get out of bed and go check the porch. When we reached the door, he unlocked it and swung it open, ready to show me nothing was there, despite my pleas to not open the door or go outside. My dad even started to say, "See, there's nothing out there," when he saw the lady who was still sitting on the porch swing. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw her. She turned slowly, staring at us with wild eyes. For a moment, everything was silent, and then my dad slammed the door shut and locked it. After telling my mom, who was now awake, to call the police, he rushed to grab his gun. When my dad returned to the door, he cracked it just enough to the point the barrel of the shotgun could go outside, and he asked the woman what she was doing and to get off our porch. The woman didn't move. Instead, she just looked at us. She finally uttered something towards my dad after a while. "Somebody killed my husband, but it wasn't me," she said. Her voice was trembling. My dad had no idea how to respond, and he just said that the police were on the way and could help her once they get there. She glanced down the street, then back at us, panic flashing across her face. She spun around and took off, disappearing into the night. My dad quickly closed the door, locking it again, and I heard him shout for my mom to keep the phone ready. He stood there until the police arrived, listening, eyes darting around as if he expected her to come back at any moment. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They searched the area and eventually found her trying to break into one of our neighbors' houses. Apparently, she was crazy and off of her medication. She had gotten into a fight with her husband and attacked him with a knife, but did not seriously hurt him. When he was able to push her out of the house, she cut herself with the knife, either trying to hurt herself or make it look like her husband did it. The police never talked to us about it, so that's just the story that we heard from the woman's neighbors. It was by far the scariest Halloween of my life so far, and after that night, I've never slept out in the living room again. The thought of that woman with the knife haunted me, and I was paranoid for most of my childhood of being in the living room late at night and hearing the sound of the porch swing moving. This happened back on Halloween night of 2016. I worked pretty late on Halloween, and I started driving back home at around 10 p.m. I lived by myself in a smaller house. I knew that I probably wouldn't be home for any trick-or-treaters with me having to work late, so I left a bowl of candy on my front step for them. Overall, I didn't really do anything for Halloween other than that. We had some decorations at work and stuff, but I was pretty busy with my job. So it took me about 15 minutes to drive home, and the roads were all pretty quiet by this time. I remember though, that when I was about a mile or so from my house, I saw this guy dressed as a clown standing on the side of the road. He was sort of off in the ditch, and this was just a sort of quiet road with woods on both sides, so it was weird that he would be standing there. As I drove by, the clown man waved at me. I knew that it was somebody dressed up for Halloween, probably trying to scare people. I waved back and continued my drive home. Just a couple of minutes later, I arrived to my neighborhood. My street was pretty typical, with many houses on it, and at this hour, all the trick-or-treaters were done, so it was now very quiet. However, as I approached my driveway, I noticed something. There was another guy fully dressed as a clown, wearing a mask and everything. He was standing right in the middle of my driveway in front of the garage and holding a balloon. Even with it being Halloween, I was still creeped out at the sight. I started to pull into my driveway, but I stopped at the back end of it. The clown looked directly at me, but did not wave or anything. I thought that maybe he would walk away or something, but he stayed put. So I rolled down my window a little and I called out to him. I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" He didn't acknowledge me at all, and he just kept standing there holding his balloon. I told him that I had to get my car into the garage, and he was in my way. He still didn't move though, so at that point, I wasn't really sure what to do. After like a full minute of me sitting there with the car running, I decided to just get out and go inside. I figured that the clown would move eventually. I parked my car at the very back end of the driveway, still a good 30 feet or so from the clown. Then I turned my engine off and got out. The clown was still standing there, continuing to look at me. Right when I started to take a few steps into my yard, the clown began to walk towards me, and he was walking at an angle where he would reach me before I got to my front door, so I stopped. And when I stopped, he did as well. I didn't know if it was a good idea to go for my front door anymore, because I would have to unlock it, and if he was going to chase after me, he would be able to catch up with me. Then, all of a sudden, I saw 3 more clowns come running out from behind my house. They were literally sprinting and heading in my direction. I didn't waste any time, and I instantly ran back for my car. I quickly got inside of it, locked the doors, and then scrambled to start my engine as quickly as I could. The 3 clowns, as well as the original one, ran right up to my car. One tried opening my driver's door, and the other my passenger's one. Within seconds, I was able to back out of the driveway, leaving them standing there. They didn't follow me into the street, but just kept standing at the end of my driveway. As I drove away, they all at once started waving at me. It was the creepiest thing I've ever seen. I drove out of my neighborhood and just went around random streets for like 5 to 10 minutes. Then I went back home, hoping that the clown men would be gone. If they were still there, I was going to call the cops. But thankfully, when I arrived back, they were all gone. I got out of my car and I looked through my backyard as well as front, and nobody was there. But when I got to my front door, I saw that the balloon that the one clown had been holding was now tied to my door handle. It was one last thing to really creep me out. I went inside and was a little worried that the clowns might return, but they didn't. That was my scariest experience that I've had during Halloween. It was Halloween night, and I was excited about the party at a friend's off-campus apartment. It was a costume party, and I ended up having a lot of fun. It was packed, and just overall a fun evening with my friends. Eventually, around 1 a.m., I decided to head home after saying my goodbyes. The drive home would take about 20 minutes. As I was leaving, I noticed another car pulling out at the same time, and they ended up turning the same way. I didn't think much of it for most of the drive, but eventually I noticed that they had been behind me for the entire drive, tailing me pretty closely as well. I decided to test it out if I was being followed, and tried to shake them off. I made a few turns, hoping to lose them, but the car still followed me. At this point, it still could have easily been a coincidence, but I had concerns, especially because of how close they were following me. I turned onto a less traveled road, and the other car stayed right behind me. I glanced at my rearview mirror, and the headlights were glaring back, illuminating the interior of my car. I could see the outline of a figure behind the wheel, but I couldn't make out any details. I even increased my speed, hoping to create some distance. I took a sharp turn onto a dirt road that led to a nearby park, hoping to lose them in the twists and turns, but the car stayed right on my tail. There was no way I was going to let this person see where I lived, so I just kept driving. I decided to head back towards the main road, desperate to find a place where there were more people. Before I could get back to the main road though, things escalated. I could see them trying to get beside me, speeding up and trying to force me off the road. I thought about calling for help, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the road. I swerved to avoid a collision, and the next time they came up and tried to push me off the road, I slammed on the brakes to avoid them. The pursuing car, which was now ahead of me after I slammed on the brakes, veered sharply and lost control, flying off the road into a ditch. I stayed in my car but didn't leave yet, because part of me still wanted to make sure they were okay and call an ambulance if I needed to. After a few seconds, they emerged from their car. The driver stood up and faced me. They were wearing a Grim Reaper costume with a mask covering their face, so I assumed that they must have been at the costume party that I had left from and followed me from there. After the confirmation that they weren't dead from the crash, I sped out of there and finished the rest of my drive back home. When I finally got back to my apartment and locked the door, I called the cops, explaining the situation and where the crash had happened. I later learned that when they arrived at the scene, the person in the costume was nowhere to be found, and the car they had been driving had been stolen. I was still very nervous after that night, because whoever had been following me knew what my car looked like and probably had my license plate, but I never had any following encounters. I live by myself in a smaller 2-bedroom house. Last Halloween, something really strange happened. I don't really celebrate Halloween or do anything for it. I'm an adult, and I'm not really into horror stuff, and I don't really have friends that are either. So most Halloweens are just a normal day for me. However, I do always make sure to have some candy on hand around Halloween to give to kids. My neighborhood is usually pretty quiet though, so I might get like 10 trick-or-treaters if that. Last year, shortly after I got home from work, the trick-or-treaters started. There were a few at around 5:30 or 6 p.m. I was mostly just in my living room, and I would occasionally get up and give the candy to the kids. I got about the usual amount of trick-or-treaters. By 8 or 9 p.m., things had quieted down significantly, and there weren't really any more people trick-or-treating. But that's when the doorbell rang as I was sitting there watching TV. I got up and walked over to the front door and looked out. I thought that it would be a kid trick-or-treating, but when I got to the door, nobody was there. I didn't think too much of it, and I went back into the living room. Probably 30 minutes later, there was a knocking at the door. It was pretty loud and constant. When I heard it, I got up, and the knocking kept going for a good 10 or 15 seconds straight. By the time that I reached the door, though, it had stopped. After looking outside, nobody was there again. This time, I stepped outside and I looked around. There was nobody that I could see, so I went back inside after that. It was probably just a prank, somebody knocking on my door and then running off, but it was kind of weird. After that though, it didn't happen again for the rest of the night. A while later, I went to bed. The next day was now November 1st, and it was a pretty normal day for me with work and stuff. That night though, at around 10 o'clock, there was another knocking on my door. This was really weird now, because it wasn't Halloween anymore. The knocking, just like the previous night, was constant and pretty loud. I went over to go and see who it was again. However, the knocking stopped as I approached, and when I finally got to look out the window, nobody was there. I once more went outside and I looked around. I even walked around the front yard a little bit. I couldn't see anybody though, so at that point I went back in, and I didn't get any more knocking that night. Well, the next night it happened yet again. Once more, it was a little bit later and I was in the living room. There was the same loud and constant knocking. This time, I stayed where I was. The knocking kept going for like 30 seconds straight though, so at that point I got up and I ran over to the door. When I approached it though, the knocking stopped again. I opened up the door and nobody was there. I looked around and thought that I saw movement down the street of possibly somebody running away, but I didn't get any kind of good look at all. I went back inside after that, and the rest of the night there was no more knocking. The next night nothing happened, and since then I haven't had any more strange occurrences. I'm guessing that it was just a prank by maybe one of the neighbors or something. Still, to do it 3 nights in a row like that after Halloween is pretty creepy. One Halloween night, when I was 15 years old, my friends and I went trick-or-treating. We were fairly old to be trick-or-treating, but we decided that it would be fun to have one last year going door to door together. We started out in our neighborhood, but we weren't getting much. We agreed to make the trek over to the rich neighborhood, which was known for giving away king-sized candy in the past. The quickest route to the rich neighborhood was a shortcut including a path through a section of the woods. My friends and I had taken this path many times before to go to other friends' houses who lived in that neighborhood. Personally, I had only been on the path during the daytime though, and I was a bit nervous to walk through a longer stretch of woods at night. However, the majority of the group didn't want to waste precious trick-or-treating time by taking the long way there, so we ended up taking the shortcut through the woods. As we entered the woods, the light and noise from the neighborhood behind us eventually faded, leaving the only sound of us crunching our way through the leaves in the forest and talking. Over the talking of the group, I thought I heard something behind us though. I heard the crunching of leaves, sounding like footsteps, but maybe it was an animal. I swung the flashlight behind us, but I saw nothing there. However, by doing this, I did get the attention of the group. Everybody fell silent and stopped walking, turning around to see what I was looking at. I explained that I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the leaves behind us, but that I didn't see anything. We chalked it up to an animal and continued walking, but we all stayed pretty quiet now, whispering amongst ourselves. A few moments later, the noise happened again. This time, everyone in the group heard it, and we whirled around to see 2 men dressed in all black off the path and a bit in the woods. This was enough to send the group running as fast as we could, wanting to get out of the forest. We didn't dare to look back, but we could hear the 2 men now crashing through the forest behind us on the path. It sounded like they were gaining on us, but we all made it out of the woods and back into the neighborhood scene just in time. Once we were back in the neighborhood, we hung around for a bit to see if the 2 men would emerge from the woods, but they never did. Maybe we just happened upon 2 guys in the woods, and they decided to play a prank on us, but it was all very strange. Since we were only 15 at the time with no adults around, it definitely felt like a dangerous situation. Back when I was in college, I had a crazy experience one Halloween. It was my junior year, and I will also mention that I'm a female for background information. I was 21 and had been going to the university for 3 years. It was a pretty large university with thousands of students, and I lived in an apartment with my roommate. So for Halloween that year, me and some friends were invited to a Halloween party. It was at a friend's house who had hosted several college parties earlier in the year. That night, we first went to a bar, and it was really busy there with it being Halloween night. Most people had all kinds of different costumes on and stuff. Then we walked over to the party at my friend's house. It was several blocks away from where we lived, and about a 10-minute walk from the bar. When we got there, there was already a good amount of people at the party, and we knew most of them. It only got busier and busier though. At one point during the Halloween party, one of my friends came up to me and pointed out a guy who was across the room. He was a guy with dark hair, and I'm not even sure what his costume was, but she told me that he was a creep, and she wanted to leave now that she saw that he was at the party. I asked her what he did, and she just said that he's really weird and he wouldn't leave her alone in the past. Then she said that she needed to get out of there before he saw her, and she walked away. I wasn't going to leave just yet though, because all my other friends were still there. So probably 30 minutes went by, and I remember that all of a sudden, this guy came up to me. It was the same guy my friend said was a creep. Personally, I had no clue who he was, and I had never seen him before. I assumed that he went to the same college though. He said hi and introduced himself to me. I was really not that interested in him, but I did have a short conversation with the guy. He didn't say anything that weird or creepy at first, but he did come across as a little strange. After talking to him for like 2 or 3 minutes, I said that I was going to get something to drink and I walked away. But the guy just followed me over there and kind of kept talking to me. By then, the party was extremely crowded, and I didn't know as many people there anymore. I really didn't want to talk to this guy, but he wouldn't leave me alone. Then, one of my friends came up to me, and she said that they were going to Jake's house and asked if I wanted to go. Jake was in our friend group, but I had never personally been to his house. By then, I was ready to leave the party, and I said yes, I would go. My friend said that she was going to get one of our other friends and then leave, and then she walked away into the crowd of people. I should have went with her right then and there, but I didn't. It was so crowded that I didn't know where anybody else was in the moment. Meanwhile, the guy continued to talk to me, and I remember he asked me if I wanted to go to his house. I told him no, I couldn't. I said that I was going to Jake's house. I remembered that this guy said that he knew where Jake lived, and he was also going there. I was not happy to hear that he was going to be there, but I asked him what Jake's address was. The guy told it to me, and I put it in my phone. Then I told him that I was going to the bathroom before leaving. I said that because I was afraid that he would want to go to Jake's with me, and I wanted this guy to leave me alone. So I walked upstairs and used the bathroom at the crowded party. When I got out, the guy was thankfully gone. My friends were also gone though. I looked all around the party for them, and I couldn't find them anywhere. So I put in the address to Jake's that the guy gave me. It was like a 15-minute walk. So I set out by myself, and I started walking on the now quiet streets. I made my way along the sidewalk, and I was seeming to be getting farther and farther away from campus, but I didn't really question it. When I got to the street that Jake lived on, I realized that it looked pretty run down. These houses were not in very good shape at all. I mean, most college houses are old and in not the best shape, but these were really rough. Soon I saw the address, but it just didn't seem right. The house appeared to have the lights off, and I couldn't tell if anybody was there. I double-checked the address on my maps, and it was correct. So I walked up to the front step, and I didn't hear any noise from inside like people talking or anything. Before I could open the door and knock though, the door opened. A man stood there, wearing all black and a ski mask. I figured it to be a costume for Halloween, but it was still creepy. I didn't recognize the guy. He didn't say anything, but he waved me in. I realized right then that I was definitely at the wrong house, because looking inside, all the lights were out. I started backing away, and I said that I was at the wrong address. Then I saw another guy emerge from the darkness in the house. It was the same guy who kept talking to me at the party. He told me to come inside, and I told him that this was not Jake's house. The guy then admitted it wasn't, and said that it was his house. I turned around and started walking away. The guy actually followed me out of the door though. He started walking after me outside, and at that point, I just took off running. I heard the guy start to run after me. I sprinted down the street and then went into a random yard. I cut through it and then went into the person's backyard. I then cut through another property to the next street over. After that, I stopped and I caught my breath. I didn't see the guy chasing me anymore. I walked along the sidewalk and called several of my friends until one of them picked up. I told them what happened. One of the guys at Jake's house came and picked me up after that. Luckily, I didn't see the other guy in the meantime. Then I was reunited with my friends. After that night, I never saw that guy again. I guess my friend was right about him being a creep. When I was a kid, my family would visit my grandparents every holiday. They lived in a small town, and my aunt lived just 2 houses down from them. But between my aunt's place and my grandparents' place was the house of a woman everybody avoided. She was a large woman, over 6 feet tall, and she dressed in a long dress with heavy work boots. Around her neck, she wore what looked like logging chains. The only time we ever saw her was in her backyard, tending to her garden or outside scrubbing the walls of her house. It was strange. She'd be out there for hours just cleaning the outside of her home. But what stuck with me was her voice. She'd scream at us kids from her yard, hurling all kinds of insults, saying the devil was coming for us. The adults always warned us to stay away from her and ignore her. She scared us to the point that when we went between our aunt's house and our grandparents' house, we would run the short distance past the strange woman's house, convinced that she'd be watching us from the windows. One Halloween, things took a turn. We were all gathered at my aunt's house, planning to go trick-or-treating. One of the older cousins dared the younger kids, which included me, to go knock on the creepy lady's door. We didn't want to seem like cowards, and in the group, there were 6 of us, so surely nothing bad would happen to a group. We went quietly onto the porch and reached for the doorbell. As soon as it rang, we heard loud banging sounds from inside, like doors being slammed or furniture moving. Eventually, the door swung open, and there she was, standing in the frame, holding a severed head which looked disturbingly real. We scrambled off of her porch and screamed as we took off running. We could hear her voice behind us as she laughed and shouted that the devil was coming for us. We told the adults back inside our aunt's house about what happened and about the head. They all just dismissed it as a Halloween prop and scolded us to stay away from the woman's house. The rest of that Halloween night was uneventful as we went trick-or-treating and stayed far away from the weird lady's house. About a month later, my parents got a phone call that the lady had tried to kill my aunt while she was bringing in groceries. The lady had one of those rope saws and had come up behind my aunt with it, putting it over her head and attempting to saw it off. My aunt was able to escape, and my uncle came and beat the lady up with a fire poker. The police investigation revealed that the woman had been digging tunnels inside her home, and they were coming up under my aunt's, my grandparents', and another neighbor's house. She had been bringing the dirt up and putting it in the raised beds of her gardens. She also had a shrine of some sort of underground, which had a few severed heads around it, revealing that the head we saw on Halloween night was indeed very real. My aunt survived the whole encounter, with the only damage being a scar across her neck. It's very scary to know what the lady was planning to do once she finished her tunnels. I'm glad that my family is safe now, and even more glad that we didn't live in that town. This is something that happened back on Halloween night when I was a kid. I remember that I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I was going to go trick-or-treating. My older sister was 16, and she did not go trick-or-treating anymore, so she was going to go with me and act as my babysitter for the night. I wanted to go trick-or-treating by myself, but my parents said that she had to go with me, and I was too young. They obviously didn't want me walking up and down the street all by myself at night, even if it was Halloween. So we set out at around 6 p.m., and I was going trick-or-treating as a football player. Our neighborhood was huge. There were many different houses along it, and the plan was to go up and down our street and maybe 3 or 4 other streets, really however much we had time to do. So my sister would walk with me along the sidewalk, and then she would stand at the end of the driveways and wait for me as I went up to the houses. I saw a decent amount of other kids and parents also out as the night went on. At one point, at least 2 hours in, I went to this one house a few streets over from ours. The driveway was pretty long, and I went up to the house and I rang the doorbell. The owner of the house said hi and gave me some candy. When I walked away though, I saw that there was this older looking minivan stopped on the side of the road. It looked like the driver of the van was talking to my sister. I walked back down the driveway to my sister, and I didn't really know what was going on. But shortly after I got there, the van just drove away. I remember my sister telling me that the guy in the van tried giving her a ride. She said that he asked her if she needed a ride, and even after she said no, he was telling her to hop in. We were both kind of creeped out about it. I didn't know if the guy had bad intentions or if he actually thought she needed a ride, but I knew that we obviously were not supposed to get rides from strangers. We kept going down the street, and I was going to more houses. About 20 minutes later, though, as I walked along the sidewalk with my sister, we saw the van again. It was driving down the road from the opposite way and going really slow. When it approached us, the driver's window rolled down. I saw this man with a beard and kind of long hair. He had an overall sloppy appearance, and as his van slowed down significantly, he said hi to me and my sister. He asked us if we needed a ride again. My sister was quick to say no, and we kept walking. The guy said in a creepy way, "You sure?" Then he drove off. My sister then said that we should probably head back now. By then, it was getting a little bit later anyways, and there were significantly less kids and parents out. Even though I wanted more candy, I agreed. I was a little bit worried that the man would come back again. So I went to just like 10 more houses, and then we decided to go back. I was satisfied with the amount of candy that I had gotten. As I walked with my sister, we got towards the end of the street that we were on and then turned. We walked past this little park that connected to our neighborhood. There were more houses on the other side of the park. As we walked past, I could just barely see the same van driving through that neighborhood. We walked faster and hoped to make it back. Soon we reached our street, but the street was very long and it would still take us a few minutes to reach our house. As we were walking down, I heard a car approaching us from behind. I looked back and saw that it was the same van. When it was still a good distance away, my sister and I both picked up that it was the van and recognized it. My sister told me to go up the driveway to the house that we were right in front of. Even though I had already trick-or-treated there, I did. This time, my sister went with me. When we got all the way up to the door, we watched, and the van slowly drove by. It appeared to almost come to a stop when it was directly in front of the house that we were at, but eventually it did drive away. Then my sister and I returned to the sidewalk. We started walking as fast as we could to get back home. Now, this was before cell phones were really that popular, and my sister didn't have one yet despite being 16, so we couldn't call my parents or anything. As we walked down the street, we soon saw up ahead that the same van was now parked on the side of the road. We would have to walk past it. We decided to just go for it, and we went even faster. We were basically jogging now. When we went past the van, at first it didn't do anything, but then I could hear it starting to drive. Our house was within sight at this point. My sister and I both started sprinting, and we got through the front yard. We went right up to the front door and then got inside. The first thing that we did after entering was lock the door behind us, and then my sister found our parents. She told them how a creepy guy was following us and stuff. We went to the window and we saw that the van was parked right out front, but nobody appeared to be inside of it. I remember that my dad actually went outside and approached the van. He knocked on the window and looked inside, but soon returned, saying that nobody was in the van. We knew that it was not a neighbor or anything. Then, like 30 seconds after my dad got inside, somebody tried opening the back door to our house. We all knew that it was the guy. My dad walked over to the back of the house and yelled from the other side that he was calling the cops. The man actually ran around our house, and then we saw him sprint back to his van and get inside. He quickly drove away after that. My parents called the police, and they arrived a while later. We told the police everything that we could, and they said that they would try to locate the man. Then they left. I'm guessing that the guy left town after that. I'm not sure if he was ever found, but I know that I never saw him again after that, and I'm really glad that my sister and I got away from him.